I think I'm going to preface this talk with a bit of an apology. It's likely to be a short and brief description of a variety of different projects that we work on, and so maybe I'm a little rambling at times. And I'm also, I come here as a cook, and it's a great honor to be invited by the guys from Flavour, because my training is as a chef, but I'm an amateur scientist, and so we come to this presentation like that. This is sort of a visual apology. We had a photographer over at our lab. Our lab is actually on a houseboat in Copenhagen Bay, so it's sort of the view that you can see outside through the window. But the photographer just wanted to know what we were working on that day, and so I slapped everything that we had in our fridge drawers on the window, and that's what it looked like. So you'll sort of understand that we often work on a wide variety of topics in a wide variety of manners. And that's often how we attack innovation and look for inspiration, is to be as far and wide-ranging as possible and then narrow it down. We're working with a lot of scientists like Ola, and it's been a really great pleasure to do that. To have a little bit more scientific rigor in how we disseminate our findings and how we go about sort of cataloging those findings. But working as a chef, we also can sort of find the better and faster path quite quickly, where we don't feel compelled to catalog an obvious failure. The Nordic Food Lab was, I'll start off with a little introduction, was founded by Ray from Noma and Lars, who's a co-owner of Noma. And it was basically their brainchild for a way to get further in depth and research their primary love of sort of food innovation, culinary innovation. Just at the beginning of this year, we had the pleasure of having Michael Frost, who's a flavor scientist from Copenhagen University, join us. That's been really great in terms of bridging the gap between the culinary arts and the science world and academia. Because we really have much more access to scientists, and we're really much more inclined to ask for help all the time, which is basically how I solve most of my problems, asking smarter people than myself. That's our houseboat, as you can see. And this is sort of one of our mantras, is to explore Nordic cuisine. And really, our main focus is to get all of our findings and all of our ideas out to as big as a community as possible. Because the Nordic Food Lab is a non-profit organization, we're sort of funded on a project-by-project basis, which keeps us compelled and hopefully quite honest. So our main focus is to get all of our ideas out as much as possible. Renee and 10 of the chefs came up with a manifesto for the New York Nordic Kitchen, which is basically a series of ideas that they felt were compelling and wanted to adhere to in how they dealt with food and how they progressed with food. A lot of it's common sense, really, and how people feel that one should deal with food. That the concept that you should treat your farmer well and give him, pay him well, that you should inspire him, that he can inspire you, that he's not just like a laborer. It's something that I think is quite common sense, and it's really been inspiring for us, where we can have a farmer that, of his own volition, leaves her produce in the ground for a year, and the end result is initially quite surprising. We had a carrot that he left in the ground for 2 years, and when we picked it up, it was this sort of odd-looking leathery thing. And we took it home and said, okay, well, let's give it a shot. And we slowly basted it and pretended it was like a piece of meat, and so we basically slow basted it in a pan for about half an hour, and the end result was transcendent. It was magical. It was crispy, and it was actually quite like a piece of meat. So the idea is that you can, any product, I feel, if you treat it well and have your producers treating their products well, is always going to give you like a much higher result. One of the other things that these boys came up with quite a few years ago is while being focused on Nordic products, is to seek inspiration from other parts of the world. And that's one of the things that we do quite a bit, is if we have an interesting product or an interesting technique, we also look to all the other corners of the world to see how they pickle things, how they smoke things, how they salt things. And we try and then, in collaboration with scientists, look into the chemical, physical aspects of how that happens and how we can then make a better product in the end. This is a really fancy picture that someone came up with. But the idea is that this is sort of how we go about our processes. Basically, the Nordic Food Lab is supposed to be an exploration for deliciousness, and that's our main goal. We're chefs. We are compelled by flavor. And so a lot of things that we do relies on intuition, but although a lot of our inspiration is from tradition. We use a lot of Scandinavian techniques for manipulating our products. I'll touch briefly on that. Typically, you need to manipulate something to release the umami or great flavor. We all know that if you don't sear a steak, it doesn't taste very good. But if you use a high searing temperature to get a Maillard reaction, you're enhancing the flavor incredibly. If you look into the science of that, you can then apply that sort of techniques to other products. And this is sort of a way to approach food that works in a variety of different manners. This is for your grits. This is an example of how we're inspired by other cultures and other traditions. And also another way to sort of use food, what would be called food waste products in a responsible fashion. This is our Nordic Marmite. Because every brewery basically throws away 90% of its beer at the end of the day through yeast. And so we just went through a bunch of different breweries and got yeast and started trying to figure out how the Marmite boys do it. There's a series of trials and tribulations, which I won't get into. But we had a very successful project, and we weren't exactly trying to copy the flavor in any way. We were trying to take the technique and the idea behind using a waste product and transforming it into something fantastic and delicious. And here we basically found a Metz brewery, successfully autolyzed the yeast, which is basically destroying the cell structure so you release all the amino acids. Through a series of processes, you can basically get something that's like very savory, like almost like a chicken stock. And here on the right, we, instead of using sort of dried, powdered vegetable things to give a sort of vegetable edge to it, we had different juices, vegetable juices that we reduced at 60 degrees over the course of 36 hours. It gave it a really concentrated flavor. And so we were able to give these very bright vegetable colors to our sort of Marmite, as it were. But then again, in part of this, we also were working on a project with nixtamalization, which is the Native American way of processing corn by cooking it in an alkaline solution with ash, which gives you the possibility of digesting a lot of the minerals that you can't really access normally in corn. We were able to use that sort of ash that we were lying around to debitter this yeast, which is, because all yeast is quite bitter from the hops that they add into it. Most of that sort of bitter hoppiness resides in the cell walls of the yeast. If you raise the pH to quite high, to about 12, and lower it again, you strip that bitterness out. And so this is, by having sort of two projects running simultaneously, we're actually able to take inspiration from one and apply it to the other. And we were able to debitter our yeast with sort of non-extremely caustic means. We didn't have to use sort of Drano or anything like that. This is a quite thick Marmite that we did, and this one has been debittered with ash from juniper wood, and then brought back to 7 with apple vinegar. So this is quite nice because it has these sort of woody tones that we lied in it, but it's the sweet apple as well. Then again, we're sort of children in our lab as well. And while we were reducing our Marmite, and it smells like chicken stock, and then we said, well, what happens to that great chicken stock smell that happens when you're in the kitchen and it sort of pervades the kitchen? Kids are a way to capture that. So we took our old pressure cooker and took a box of ice and sort of ran some tubing through it, and 5 minutes later we had a very simple distillation setup. and we actually successfully captured the volatile compounds. And this is something we want to show people, that a lot of the science that we deal with on a sort of practical basis is actually quite easy to replicate, and a lot of the more complicated techniques that we talk about are not that difficult to do in any amateur kitchen. Like this one as well. This is we're making a sort of solid state vinegar out of buckwheat here, which is actually a 4-stage fermentation process. It takes forever, but it gives you like a very, very complex vinegar flavor because of that. It has these umami flavors. And, but basically, I bought a very cheap PID controller and then hooked it up to, actually this is a warming mat from that you normally put under the floor, like in a bathroom. So we had this was like 100 quid of equipment instead of spending thousands on a sort of normal incubator. So again, we like to show people that a lot of this stuff is quite accessible if you're interested in doing it. A series of our vinegars, we have beetroot, carrot, I think rhubarb, green apple, and celery. So this is a project that we often have going on. We're always sort of working on vinegars because there's a lot of potential there, and the more that we do it, the more we realize that basically you can make vinegar out of anything. And it's really fantastic, and it's great to sort of use vinegars as spices and seasonings, as opposed to always going to the sherry vinegar or the white wine vinegar. That if you have an array of 50 vinegars, that you can then pair your carrot soup with the carrot vinegar, or use your celery vinegar with your carrot soup to give it an extra depth. So we're really trying to encourage people to look more beyond what they normally use, and that's sort of a thing that we keep working on. This is just, we had, again, if people think of something like doing a vinegar at home is a very complicated process, and basically it's not. There's enough acidic bacteria usually floating around that any alcohol will eventually turn into vinegar. If you have an unpasteurized vinegar, and a lot of sort of more natural vinegars you can find aren't terribly well pasteurized, you add a little bit to the alcohol that you're trying to turn into vinegar if it happens quite quickly. And here we have just very cheap pumps for my like fish pumps, basically. That would speed up the process to about 5 days. So, this is another process we're looking at different ways of making sort of acidic or vinegars. This is a kombucha mother, which, though quite similar to the way that a vinegar mother works, is actually a symbiotic construct of yeast and bacteria. So it acts continually converting sugars into alcohol, and then the alcohol is immediately into acidic compounds. So it never gets above, it basically can top out at 0.5%. So it's a great way of making vinegars at home. And again, this is quite easy. You can find these things on a lot of hippie websites, and we got this one from a notorious area of Copenhagen called Copenhagen. But we were able to typically some of those very sweet tea, and we found that most vegetable juices, like carrot you see on the right, is easily converted because it has a quite high sugar content. So this is sort of a new flavored beverage for us. We're sort of making a quick carrot alcohol and immediately turning it into vinegar. This complex flavors that we have. Again, we're also always looking for flavors and ways to extract flavors from what are considered often boring vegetables. In this, we were working on just looking for different spices and different ways of processing things. And we basically just cut up some cucumbers and dried them at 60 degrees for 24 hours. And they actually caramelized. You can see it's slightly reddish. And it had this like lovely, slightly sweet, deep, intense caramel flavor. It's actually almost like a Rizal Hanut or a Middle Eastern spice. And it was sort of a revelation for us that there's something that we consider to be so much in one direction that by processing in a certain fashion, we could see it transformed into a brand new flavor. And interestingly, at 65 degrees, it turned bitter, like as it was burnt. This is another project we worked on, an inspiration by garum. It's a sort of fish sauce from Noma times that was one of the most highly prized commodities at the time. Like legionnaires would take it into battle. It's talked about quite often in history books. But there's also a way, again, for us to use what would be bycatch or waste material and find a way to process it into fashion that you get a very beneficial result from. Here I did it with just offcuts from a different project that we were working on. So this is just basically fish guts and heads. And again, by doing a lot of research, talking to different chefs around the world and talking to different scientists, we were able to turn this into an amazing fish sauce. Fish sauce, I don't know if you guys are familiar with non-plow, but this is quite similar to that. We were able to actually speed up the process by talking to some microbiologists. We added some fermented barley into it, and actually speed up the process from what would typically be a year to 10 weeks, and also give it a little bit more roundness and depth. So that was a great result. And we're actually, with this, we're trying to work together with, they're setting up a very large fish market in Copenhagen, a way for them to then process their waste products into a way that would then be like a sustainable sauce, and they wouldn't be just dumping it into a landfill. They could be using something like fish barley. This is what the fermented barley looks like. This was an inspiration from basically Japanese miso, and this is an example of how we sort of will collaborate with scientists in academia. When we were working on this project, we went to databases to look for legumes and pulses that had high levels of glutamic acids, and yellow peas was one of them. And this was a great project for us because yellow peas in Scandinavia are like sort of grandmother food. It's like what your grandparents made for you as like a sort of a pot of stew that's cooked with a hammock. And it's very like traditional, old-fashioned kind of food. And here we were able to transform it into something completely novel and give it a new sort of life and a new identity in our cuisine. And that's, again, one of the things that we're always looking for. It's just a close-up of what it looks like. It's a little scary to some people. But so there's a lot of things in that order. And then in a moment of intuition, I've been dealing with this fermented barley product for about, 5 months, and we never tried cooking it as a product in itself. And we had one of those sort of like eureka moments. And I was like, why don't I just put it into a saute pan? And but I let it over ferment a little bit, so it turned into a solid sort of cake, as it were. And we just sauteed it like, again, it was like a piece of meat, and it's incredible. It has these, Renee thinks it tastes like a Bierko, the fat off of a Bierko ham, but it still has a sweetness and deep complexity. And again, so now we have a product that's healthy, tastes like meat, but doesn't have the sustainability issues or the sort of health issues that eating recently would have. This is one of our new favorites. Not that we get too wrapped up in health issues so much. We were getting focused on this. This is sort of to overlap on what Ola was talking about, because again, with using products that people sort of view as waste, this is just like the beach landscape, and this is what people think of when they see seaweed. And although Ola used a different analogy, the one that we like to use is if you were to walk into an apple orchard and just pick up the rotten apples that have fallen from the tree, you wouldn't think very highly of that as an end product. But if you just look up or look in the right place, you'll find a beautiful apple that's one of those is amazing. And the same goes for seaweed. And if you just find a way to harvest it right, take care of how you produce it. Yeah, they're going to send out, actually, this is, well, we're working with, on the project Ola in terms of trying to extract high levels of glutamic acid. We chose Rasu kombu, which is sort of like the heavyweight box for kombus. It's a very, very high level in terms of taste, but it's by far the highest glutamic acids, and so we took a really strong one to see how it would compare ultimately. And again, it's sort of our whimsical way that we approach things. Sometimes we say, well, why don't we just try out drying into dashi? And it basically becomes concentrated umami. It's quite intense and slightly salty, so just need to warn. But we found it's an amazing use as a spice. You can add it, I would say, in a very similar way that people could add, let's say Italians add anchovies to sauces. It is a spice, so it's quite intense, but it has that punch and its meatiness and I think a level of complexity that's very interesting. So by doing sort of a reduced dashi style, we're able to emulate some ways of producing umami that other cultures do. Oh, and the other small sample is just the actual Rasu kombu in its natural form. A little candle. Like Olu was talking about with the katsubushi, we started investigating, again, other products that we can replicate that sort of synergy that happens when you have dashis and other nucleotides that sort of have that synergistic effect. And we found that cured ham has a high level of balsamic acid, just like the katsubushi has. And so initially we tried doing it, adding bacon very, very briefly to the dashi, just like you would with the katsubushi, and it was delicious. But everyone knows that bacon makes it mostly delicious. But it was also a way for us to take something that is very typically Japanese flavored with katsubushi and the kombu dashi. And by using an Icelandic dashi and a Scandinavian sort of bacon, it really put the whole characteristic of this umami much more in the Scandinavian palate. And that's something that we often we're really focused on when dealing with seaweeds. It's a way to incorporate seaweeds in a fashion that's consistent with how they approach food initially. We're not trying to force a Japanese salad and say, now you love Japanese food. It was rather we're trying to show people that they could bring it into the fold of their everyday life and their everyday cuisine in a way that made sense to them. And then I made my own sort of pork bushi, which, just like katsubushi, has been well cooked, smoked, inoculated in the mold several times over until it's hard as a rock. And this was a much more complex and delicate way of adding that last stage of umami. And then this is one that we love to show people when they come onto our Houseboat. Just to open their minds a little bit, because most people probably don't think about seaweed when they think about ice cream. And again, you think about this sort of products up on the beach. And we like to show that by taking care of processing the seaweed, you can really extract some of the much more delicate flavors and delicate elements of that seaweed. And it's not all sort of that sort of fishy, oceany taste. This is just an example of a cheese that we sort of consulted on working with a big manufacturer. So that was a successful project that's now being sold in stores. This is a really fancy looking picture. This is a chart of metabolic pathways, and this is one of the things that we're really, really focused on right now. That is, how can we take all these complex fermentations that we're working on and give a sense of terroir through fermentation. That is, how can you take a really beautiful, high quality product and then give it, that already has a sort of sense of identity in itself, and then boost that identity by fermenting it in a particular way, the particular mold that has locality to it as well. In the same way that sourdoughs are transformed from place to place. If you have sourdough from San Francisco and bring it to New York, within 2 weeks it tastes different. just sort of the natural yeast and the way that it reproduces in a different environment. So all fermentations, natural fermentations, have a sense of terroir. And so we're actually working with different microbiologists to produce new fermentations that will give a focused sense of terroir through the transformation that they work with different scientists like Ola and really get a feel for how they work. Also sort of see the toys they have in their labs and trying to figure out how good uses for them. But we're also trying to expand the way that we approach problems and the way that we think that people can consider culinary uses. We actually, one of the new projects we're working on is sort of defining the line between edible and inedible, and where that, if you can believe it from all the stuff I've showed you so far, but where that falls in different cultural contexts. The first way that we're approaching that is an investigation to why Europeans don't eat insects. So I actually have tons of grasshoppers, crickets, and whatnot crawling around in my lab at the moment. But and so, in what way can we expand things that we view as deliciousness? One of the things they serve in Noma now as a snack is live fjord shrimp. And they're served in a little glass bowl, and they're brought live to the table. And it's quite intense for some guests, and but they're delicious and they're very fresh and not sort of fishy in any way. But it's really crossing boundaries or pushing people's boundaries. And we're actually working with a sociologist now, sociologist working on the boat with us now, from Oxford actually, and he's sort of looking into the greater social context and why people consider things inedible and unedible. But that's just a way of demonstrating how we're really trying to attack the innovation in culinary practice from a very different, like a lot of different ways. So this is seaweed ice cream. And unfortunately, we were initially going to set up the room a little bit differently. So you guys just have to pass it along and share a little bit. But that's what conviviality is, no?